thank you so much for joining me. And as I was telling you earlier, I'm so excited about the interview because I run a website called Old 77, and if anything, if there's a sound that kind of defines what we're talking about, I think it's pretty much your sound. So very excited.
That's kind of terrifying for me, actually, because I'm an indie rock guy, and I have clients from all over the world, but most of them are pretty low profile at this point. Um, the As of about 20 years ago, a lot of the indie labels kind of disappeared, but people started just doing it themselves over the internet. Now everybody I know is on Bandcamp.
Right.
So I'm working just as hard as I ever was, but there are no labels promoting most of the bands that I work with. But records are still getting made. People are still hearing them. It's definitely a different. It's a different situation with the music business now than it was when I first got started in the late '80s. But I'm still busy doing what I do. But it's funny that you said, because I'm not sure how much influence music taste has at this point. It's all, everybody is in a niche.
You mentioned the underground, the music underground now, but was the situation that much different in the late 80s? I guess before the success of Bleach and the first Soundgarden EP, things like that. Was there such a spotlight on Seattle, or was it similar to now?
Well, in the late 80s, there was a spotlight in Seattle, but not until 1989. Prior to that, we were just, operating, entertaining ourselves, really. But, everything is different since then. I mean, we had indie labels. There was a sort of a network of, we had zines. We didn't have the internet. We didn't even have cell phones. So you had, people would publish fanzines. There was actually a music press to some extent. There were magazines in every city, every state. There were local music magazines. There was music was a more important part of the culture.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I've read and seen a lot of the the interviews and read the books about the Seattle scene. What I found very interesting is that everyone that talked about the earlier days seemed to be very thrilled to maybe have a job and do music on the side and go to each other's gigs and things like that. They seemed really enthusiastic about it.
I don't know. I think that's that's kind of how it was everywhere. Every local music scene was sort of similar in the '80s. Um, a lot of people working terrible jobs and playing in their band on weekends and getting $100 at their gig or whatever it was. I mean, Seattle was just another city with an independent music scene. We were somewhat isolated from the rest of the United States, which is one that graphic isolation doesn't really matter as much now. I mean, here we are. I'm talking to you in Romania, I guess.
Right.
You're in Romania, right?
I am, yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is inconceivable 30 years ago.
And it is very interesting. For example, I was going to bring up the Deep Six compilation. It's enormously famous even here and throughout Europe. But I guess it is odd because from what I understand, it was just a compilation to sort of showcase what was then a tiny music scene.
Correct.
There's been, I guess, a lot of talk about the Seattle sound, and in some ways, maybe there's some sort of similarity between the bands that were on the Deep Six compilation. Could you tell me where that sound comes from? More precisely, where did the Skinny Yard sound come from?
Oh, where did the sound come from?
I suppose
it came from the music taste of the members of the band, because I was probably coming from a '70s psychedelic and hard rock background. I know our bass player Daniel was very much interested in a lot of early 80s post-punk and things like Joy Division and Killing Joke. And I was more the guy who was interested in King Crimson and Led Zeppelin. And our singer Ben was kind of he was actually a DJ at our local college radio station, which was called KCMU. And his music taste was very wide. I think in the early days, he sounded a little bit like David Bowie sometimes, until he sort of found his own voice, which, you know, if you listen to the Grunt Truck records he made later, his style changed. And we had 5 different drummers. So, you know, everyone brought a different flavor.
That's very interesting, because I actually wanted to ask you how you felt about I guess the grunge label that was later added. There certainly seems to be a certain similarity between the bands from that period, but what was it actually called, I guess, before grunge?
Didn't have a name. You know, it was just bands playing in Seattle and everybody sort of knowing each other. Literally, I remember a review of the Deep Six article came out. Excuse me, an article which was a review of the Deep Six album came out, where the writer said specifically, "We need a name for this. What do we call this?" You know, there needs to be a name for this music, because it's not punk rock, it's not metal. What is this? And then, you know, a year or so later, the grunge tag appeared. People started using that. I don't know. There was a lot of other music coming out of Seattle that really didn't have anything to do with that style. We had a very good music scene in many styles, which people know now. I mean, you know, there are plenty of bands. I mean, think of the Presidents of the United States, think of Gas Huffer, think of Coffin Break, think of The Accused, think of I don't know, I could go on. There were plenty of bands from those from that era, from those years, that you wouldn't call a grunge band, but they're Seattle.
Right. Like Queensryche, I suppose, were very successful in that period, and I guess there's something
were. And there were a lot of metal bands too. You don't hear about them as much, but there were a few. And I think Alice in Chains actually came out of that scene, because there were a few bands that didn't start as, you know, many of us were like garage bands. We started playing in a basement, and then we'd play bars, and then maybe put out an indie record. Some bands, Queensryche, I don't think they ever played bars. You know, they went straight to the recording studio and got a record deal, which doesn't work for everybody.
Well, right. I was actually just going to ask you about the technical ability, because obviously that's not something that's, I guess, so often talked about. But for most of those bands, it seemed like they were already quite competent musicians.
No, I wouldn't say so.
All right.
We were all amateurs. No, amateurs is the word. I mean, everybody was a self-taught, you know, do-it-yourself kind of musician. I mean, I would say inspired amateurs would be how you would call it. This is the do-it-yourself aesthetic that we had in those days. Was, well, you know, just pick up a guitar and learn a few chords and do it, get started. That was the punk rock ethic, really. I mean, it wasn't about taking music lessons and studying music theory. It was, you know, what can you do right now with what you know how to do? Can you write a good song? Can you sing a good melody? We weren't really concentrating on playing ability or technical skill. I mean, that comes with time. As you just play more and more, you can't help it. You're going to get better at what you do. But you know, when these bands started, that wasn't the idea. The idea was to have fun.
Right. Well, that's actually, I guess, really encouraging for the rest of us, because many people play covers of those songs, and they seem very complicated to a lot of people. But is the DIY ethic also how you started producing music? And I guess, how did you become sort of a producer for most of those bands in that scene?
Well, I was always an engineer type. In fact, I have a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, which I got years before I was in a band. So I was always very comfortable with equipment. And I always had, I had a 4-track recorder and a basement studio set up long before I was in a band. So I was always recording and trying to learn how to do better. Um, so when I actually started playing in bands, it was completely natural for me to be recording the rehearsals, making demos in the basement. You know, we'd write a song and I'd say, wait, let me record that. So when I started working in the studio, you know, it was natural. All my friends were musicians at that point. So the recording and the music grew at the same time for me. I was learning how to record while I was learning how to play guitar. Um, and they were always there. Even today, I mean, I have a band called Beyond Captain Orca. It's a live instrumental improv psychedelic trio. We don't have a singer, we don't have any songs, and we don't rehearse. It's a strange band, but we have our fans, and every show is different. We don't know what we're going to do, and that's part of the fun. But we record all of them. I record every show multi-track on a Pro Tools rig, and afterwards I take the good parts and I mix it down and we put it on a Bandcamp site. So I'm always recording, even with other bands. I think I'm in 4 bands right now, and I always have a microphone in the room recording just in case something amazing happens and we say, wait, there's a part, let's make a song out of that part that you just played. So it's important to it's just, they're both important to me. I mean, when I was younger, I thought, if you're not recording, you can't prove that anything happened. So you need to record and make sure you don't miss something amazing.
And that's brilliant. I should actually ask you about that, because you mentioned Pro Tools. And I know that there are a lot of people that are very enthusiastic about old recording techniques and analog. Do you find that there's a big difference?
Yeah, I'm not really interested in old recording techniques except for specific effects. I spent many years recording on analog tape and splicing tape with a razor blade, and you know, learning how to punch in and out quickly and exactly on the beat. You had no margin of error. You had to punch in your overdub exactly at the right moment and punch out exactly at the right moment, because you're erasing what's on the tape when you do that. You had to get it right, and you didn't always get it right. It was very tense sometimes. And everything I do now is much faster than it was in the 80s, because I've become very skilled at using Pro Tools. It's interesting because you can actually, people think that with computers and Pro Tools and digital recording that you're going to make everything more sterile and perfect. But that's a matter of how you choose to use the technology, because in the old days, you couldn't keep a first take of a song usually. If the band recorded the first take, there was usually a mistake in it. The drummer would drop a stick, or there'd be a missing kick drum beat or something, but there'd be something that you couldn't fix. And you'd have to say, well, I'm sorry, you have to record the song again. Now a band can record the first take of the song, and I can just go in and, oh, there's a missing snare hit, I'll just paste one in and fix it. See, it's fixed, it's done. We just kept the first take of the song, which there were times in the 80s when a band would play the song 10 times in a row, 20 times in a row, until somebody didn't make a mistake. And now I can keep the earlier takes that have a fresh feeling to them and just digitally repair the small mistakes that were made and still keep the feel of a take that is fresh. Does that make sense? It's how you use the technology. So I'm still able to make records extremely fast if the musicians are prepared.
It does. And was that the method that you used for your most recent album? And I should ask you, I guess, why the delay between making solo records? What was the reason for that?
Well, this is the problem with a solo record is, first of all, I have to do it when I'm not recording records for other people. And second of all, I have very high standards for my own music because of the bands I'm recording. I don't want to make a record that's just, oh, some engineer made a record. It's like, well, no, it needs to be as good as the best bands that I've recorded myself. Um, I'm not going to make a crappy record. I know what a good record sounds like, and I apply those standards to myself. The other thing is, you know, I have a life as a musician. I'm always in bands. I've been in dozens of bands, played shows for 30 years, but I've always been an engineer as well. And they are two different sides of your brain. You have the analytic side of your brain and the creative side of your brain. I mean, there is literally a left brain, right brain thing. I always get confused which one is which, but the idea of producing and recording your own record, it's very difficult because it's like you are wearing two different hats, the analytical side and the creative side at the same time. That's hard to do. When I'm trying to be creative, the engineer side of me is always getting in the way and going, well, wait a minute, you need to work on that guitar tone a little more or something. So it's difficult. And I'm not fast at making solo records. This is only my fourth solo album since 1989. So I'm not fast. I spend more time working on, like, another band that I play in right now. It's called Sky Cries Mary. And we have made two albums in 2 years. Our new record is called Wandering in the Vastness. It just came out. Our last record was called, Secrets of a Red Planet, and it came out March 2020. What could go wrong, you see?
Right.
And we have not all been in the same room in 2 years, but we made another record because everyone has a home studio. We sent files back and forth, and I sort of did the mix and the compiling everything together. So the music continues, but I'm saying I probably spend more time working on music with bands that I play in than my own solo material. So it takes me a long time to finish because it's got to be right.
Plus, it seems like the lyrics for most of the songs are of a very personal nature. So I suppose that also adds to.
It is
the
hard
pressure.
because I'm not very fast at writing lyrics. I have to say that that's a weakness for me, is how much time I spend on the words, because some of the songs could be years old, could be many years old, and that's how long it takes me to find words sometimes. They're finished when they're finished. But I'm happy with the new record, actually. It was hard. My last record was Permanent Fatal Error. It came out in 2006, and a difficult record to follow, but I'm glad that I managed to make another record that I'm happy with. So now I have to start writing more songs.
Right. And you mentioned, or it was mentioned at some point, that you were also, or you'd worked on the singing aspect as well, and probably you've never been happier with the vocal tone that you're getting here, and it does sound wonderful. So how's that been a progress, because you did start out as a guitarist, I guess, almost exclusively.
I did. This is the thing. Skinyard never let me sing. We had a singer, Ben McMillan, and I got near the microphone. They would be like, "No, get out. Let Ben do it," and that was fine. He was a better singer than I was. And it was only in the last decade that I had some bands where I ended up singing. I had a band called Candy Coated. We were on Volcom's record label, and I got to sing a lot of backing vocals in that band. Almost every song had harmonies. And even there were a few songs where I sang lead during our sets. And we played for 3 or 4 years a lot. So I sang a lot. And right after that, I had my band Endino's Earthworm again with the drummer and bass player from Candy Coated. After that band broke up, I said, hey, you guys want to play my songs now? So that became the period when I was playing with the Earthworm, and I was the lead singer for that band and sang for an entire set. And we played for 3 or 4 years, and I sang constantly, and I started finally getting comfortable with it. You have to get comfortable with your voice, and the only way to do it is to just do it a lot. And sooner or later you find what works, and you begin to believe what you're doing. And actually, once you believe in what you're singing and how you're singing it, the audience believes it as well. They can tell if you're unsure of yourself. So I found, you have an instrument right here. It only does certain things, but you have to find what are the good things that it can do. So I finally sort of cracked the code on singing, actually. So I'm pretty comfortable with the way it sounds on the record, and that's good.
It does
And
sound really.
I haven't had a live show in 2 years, really. So it's unfortunate that I don't have a band or a way to promote this record. That's just the times we live in, I'm afraid.
But do you have plans if things should return to something close to normal to play it live, or at least part of the material?
Well, my drummer passed away from cancer about a year ago. And that's tough because his name was Johnny Graziadei, Johnny G. And we lost him to stomach cancer. And that's unfortunate because he was a very important part of the Earthworm. So I'd have to find another drummer. And it's hard, so I don't know. It's up in the air, really. Everything has changed so much in the last year or two that I'm just not sure live shows anytime soon are going to be worth it. Hard thing to say. We just have to wait and see.
And were actually the musicians featured on the record, like Barrett Martin, was that recorded live in a room, or was it also through files sent back and forth?
No, everything on the record was recorded live in the room, except my guitar parts I do on my own. Everything on the record was recorded before COVID. The solo record actually began in 2010. I did a session with Barrett Martin, who is, he was the drummer on the last two Skin Yard records, and I've known him for, 30 years or more. And and he's a good friend and a client. He brings me his solo records to mix. So sometimes I can call him up and say, hey, will you play on some of my songs? I've got some difficult ones that I've saved for you. So I got him in the studio, and we recorded, 6 or 7 instrumental pieces that I had written. And there's my screen blacking out. What the hell? Okay, there we go. Good. And then we recorded a few tunes, and then that gave me something to work on lyrically. Some of them stayed instrumental, some of them became vocal tunes. So that was the foundation of a new record. And then I thought I had a record deal. I had a bunch of songs that I recorded with Barrett, and some older material left over from Permanent Fatal Error, and even a couple of songs from the 90s. And I pieced it together, and I had an album, and I had a record label in 2012 that was going to release it. I had an album title. It was going to be called Set Myself on Fire. And the label put out a 12-inch EP for me with the song Rumble by Link Wray, the Rumble EP. It was 3 songs with my cover of Rumble. which was a song by Link Wray that came out in 1958. You could almost call it the first grunge tune. It's that
right.
kind of song. Um, and then the record label went bankrupt and disappeared. So I had no record deal again. And then I started my band Earthworm, and I wrote more songs and recorded those, and then said, okay, let's just change this record entirely. And so the record changed. I threw away half the songs, made more songs. So some of it has Barrett Martin on it, some of it has my newer band on it. And I had to sort of make it work together as an album. And, and then finally the time was right for it to be finished. I was sitting here in 2020, lockdown, with nothing to do. It was time to finish the record. So I finished the last of the vocals and the last of the guitar overdubs and managed to remix all of it. And here we are, finally I have a record. So it takes a pandemic and a lockdown for me to finish an album, I think. Fortunately, not for anybody else's records, just for mine.
Right. But was the because you mentioned the difficulties in just releasing music, was it similar to, or is it similar to the past? Because if you don't mind, I wanted to ask you about Sub Pop, because one of the stories that I heard was that some of the bands that worked for Sub Pop ended up switching to different labels just because Sub Pop didn't really have the funds to continue working with them. I think I heard that story about Soundgarden after making the Screaming Life EP that you worked on.
That's completely true. That is entirely true, because Sub Pop in the early days was not making very much money. It was difficult to sell a lot of records because these artists were not very commercial. The distributors were always very difficult to get money from. So, it was always a challenge for an independent record label to stay in business, because it's just not an easy business to make a profit with. It never has been. So Sub Pop had a real problem staying in business. They had a lot of loans. There was a lot of money that they borrowed from friends in the early days of the label, and I actually have encountered a few of these friends years later. Found out who some of them were. No names, but before they had any really successful records on the label, they were operating on what we call a shoestring, meaning the money going in and the money going out were exactly the same, and there was no room for error. Soundgarden, of course, were one of the very first bands that was on the label. Their first 7-inch, it was on blue vinyl, was one of the very first releases on Sub Pop. And then the Screaming Life EP was one of the very first releases on Sub Pop. Also one of the very first records that I ever worked on for anybody. Green River was another of those bands. And Nirvana and Mudhoney came about maybe just a couple years later. And Sub Pop didn't really, they had enough money to press the records, but then they didn't really have the money to promote them very well. So Soundgarden and Mudhoney in particular both thought, well, we don't know if this label is going to even stay in business, because I know that in 1988, Sub Pop bounced a few checks to the studio I was working at. As we say, a check bounces when they give you the check and then the bank doesn't pay it. That's called a bounce. And Sub Pop was bouncing checks to a few people, which is never a good sign for your record label. So it, the bands were basically thinking, well, we need somebody a little more serious here. So that is how Sub Pop lost Soundgarden and Mudhoney and Nirvana to major labels. Now, lucky for them, Mudhoney's last record for Sub Pop was called Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge, and it sold a lot of copies. Bleach didn't start selling until after Nevermind came out on DGC. And after that, to this day, Sub Pop sells a lot of copies of the Bleach album. Um, so, things worked out for Sub Pop actually after those bands went on to other labels. Um, but it was a strange time. I'm surprised that Sub Pop survived that period, but they did survive and they're doing very well now.
That's true, and they're still putting out interesting alternative music. Is it okay if I ask you about some of those records?
Which ones?
I guess all of them, but you actually mentioned the Screaming Life record, and one of the legends that I heard was that it was quite successful in the underground, so much so that it kind of provoked the interest from major labels to sort of scout Seattle for bands.
I think that may be true. That may be true, actually. I don't know how successful it was in terms of record sales at the time, but the major labels definitely paid attention to it. And Soundgarden was one of the first bands from our little music scene that even was speaking with a major label, actually, one of their very first. I mean, of course, Queensryche would have been the first, and perhaps Metal Church, but they were sort of a different music scene. I mean, I didn't even know those guys and never saw them. Um, that was that earlier wave of Seattle metal was from like 1984, 85, something like that. Wasn't really part of the grunge scene. That is a different story that I cannot really tell you. Um, but Soundgarden and Nirvana, Mudhoney, Tad, the early Sub Pop bands all came out of the club scene in Seattle, and it was like it was a little social circle actually. Everybody knew each other. We played in each other's shows. I mean, Skin Yard opened for Soundgarden many times. Nirvana opened for Skin Yard 4 times actually. The fifth time we opened for them. Uh, so, everyone played on the same stages. Not sure what I'm getting at, but
I've seen
carry on.
occasional videos of live shows from Seattle, and I guess they're filmed on cameras, on small cameras, and it's the audience always seems to be made up of musicians that maybe you'd later know. I found that very interesting.
Yes, musicians and their family members and their spouses and boyfriends and girlfriends and housemates and co-workers. Yeah, that's a lot of. I remember the early shows where there would be maybe 100 people in the audience, and I would probably know, a third of them were people I had recorded.
Wow.
Even now, there are shows that happen here in Seattle where every band that's on stage is somebody that I've worked with over the last 30 years. Um, it's kind of funny actually when that happens, but it does. Uh, but things are different now, though. It's a much bigger city with a much more diverse and larger music scene um, than what we had back then. It was pretty small. Um, you sort of knew everybody, so you had to get along with everybody.
Right. And you mentioned it was kind of, like I said, very encouraging that you mentioned that you believe that you were sort of amateurs that were very excited about what you were doing. But uh, because we were talking about the Soundgarden EP, well, they sound really good, and especially obviously Chris Cornell is still one of these singers study to try and replicate his kind of vocal sound. Was that apparent from the beginning with Soundgarden and with the other bands that these were really talented and sort of disciplined musicians? Because I assume that you also kind of need discipline to kind of create that sound.
To some extent, yes. In fact, Chris Cornell actually took a guitar lesson from me one time
Wow.
because he wanted to get better on guitar, and I didn't charge him anything for it because I couldn't really teach him very much other than just how I played some of the Skin Yard songs. I wasn't much of a teacher, and I told him that. I said, "Well, look, I can show you how I play. I can't really teach you how to play guitar." Uh, he goes, "We're amateurs." Um, but I knew he was a good singer, and I also knew that Kurt was a good singer. You could tell just from the short time I spent in the studio with him initially. I thought, wow, this guy's got something interesting going on in his voice. And of course, Chris Cornell was always amazing. And he continuously got better and better, because in the early Soundgarden days, most of what he did was screaming, and kind of you can hear that, I think, on there's a song on Screaming Life. I think Tears to Forget is on there. Um, and he just screams the lyric. Well, he did everything in 1985, but by 1987 he had figured out how to just sing, and he just got better and better at it. Now, some of the bands, you don't think of them for lead vocals, really. You think of them for their songs. But again, inspired amateurs just doing it and learning how to do it as they go. That was kind of how it was. There were a few people at some point. I think Chris ended up taking some vocal lessons, because once a band goes out on the road and you can't scream all the time, you blow your voice out after a few shows, you can't sing anymore. You have to learn how to control it. And at that time, maybe it's good to get some professional assistance to help you manage your instrument. So there were people taking vocal lessons here once they realized that this was serious and they needed to take care of their voice. We had a few vocal teachers that were pretty well known, but of course I never did that.
And it sounds really great, really great.
I'm more of a screamer anyway. I like Lemmy.
I do as well. I do as well. And you also mentioned Kurt Cobain singing. I guess one of the legends is that he disliked his singing. I should ask you if that's true. And I guess there's also the legends about Nirvana kind of not taking themselves too seriously, which I'm also wondering if it's true, because they do seem to have been rather ambitious, I guess, about what they were doing.
Well, here's the thing with the Seattle bands. Most of them took their music seriously, but did not take themselves that seriously, which was why it was such an interesting music scene. Because if you took yourselves too seriously here, people would laugh at you. They'd say, "You're from Seattle, what are you doing?" There was always a certain element of humor involved, but at the same time, you had to take your music seriously because it was important to you. And people could tell. The problem when certain bands became more successful and had money and opportunities thrown at them and a lot of fame is, at that point, you're forced to take yourself more seriously, because the whole world is suddenly taking you very seriously. And I think that was it was a difficult psychological adjustment for some bands, to suddenly realize that everything they say is going to wind up in People magazine, for instance. How do you suddenly take yourself that seriously when you haven't really taken yourself that seriously up to now? It's something that they would have to, something that Kurt had to learn how to do. I don't know if he was ever that comfortable with it. Yeah, it's a tough question, really.
Right. What was Nirvana, or was Kurt Cobain's songwriting ability obvious? Because my theory is that the Seattle scene and grunge music is still very appreciated, especially because of the songs. There are a lot of heavy bands out there, but not a lot of them actually write songs.
Yes, it's true. Everybody was trying to write songs. Even now, I mean, I look back, everybody had songs with verses and choruses. There'd be a bridge. Mudhoney, pop songs. Nirvana, pop songs. Soundgarden, maybe a little more metally, but still verses, choruses, hooks, as we say, catchy melodies. This was classic pop and hard rock songwriting, really, with noisier guitars and perhaps a less serious attitude.
What was that something that Sub Pop sort of realized that was a possibility, that they wrote distinct poppy also heavy songs, Nirvana and all the other bands?
I don't know. I do know that the guys who started Sub Pop, Bruce Pavitt and John Poneman, were both students, if you will, of, I don't mean literally as in school, but just in terms of psychologically, they were students of the entire history of pop music. And so was I, literally from the moment I first heard rock and roll when I was 13 years old, I was hooked. And I have a ridiculous record collection, and you can sort of see some of it behind me on the shelf there. That's just the CDs.
Wow.
It's we had the whole history of music at our fingertips, or at least in our record collections. Now we do have it at our fingertips because of the internet. But so there's a reason why John Poneman told Nirvana to take their Shocking Blue cover Love Buzz and make it the A side of their first 7-inch,
Right.
because it was the catchiest thing in their set at the time. Nirvana was not really writing pop songs; they were writing little hard rock songs. Bleach is a hard rock record, really, much more so than a pop record. And but Jonathan thought, well, your Shocking Blue cover, that's going to get people's attention, and I suppose it worked. So I'm a pop guy too. I like a good song with hooks and a melody and a chorus, even if the guitars are cranked up to 10. Look at it. I mean, even the stuff that Ozzy did, it's pop. You could even call Black Sabbath a pop band if you really look at how their songs are structured. Zeppelin too, any of that classic rock stuff, AC/DC, it's all pop songs. That's how it got on the radio.
Right. What were you actually surprised of the way those, especially in Nirvana, of the way they evolved? Nevermind, I guess, was even a popular record in many ways.
Very much so. I've found, looking back, I find the In Utero record, the record In Utero is almost the most interesting to me, because it's the record where Kurt became self-aware, and he started thinking much harder about his lyrics. So the lyrics are very interesting on In Utero, and the whole atmosphere is of a band suddenly aware of how important they are and still trying to make a good record while everybody is looking at them. It's a strange record, actually. The music it sort of was going in another direction. It's an interesting record for me, because I'm not sick of those songs like I am with Bleach. And of course, Nevermind got played way too much on the radio. So if I want to listen to Nirvana, I'll put on the In Utero record because it's still a little more fresh to me.
Right. Well, I'm wondering what was happening in Seattle after, I guess, 1991, once many of those bands were quite successful, and I suppose touring and making records and everything else.
Well, it was interesting because by 1992, we had most of the big bands that I had recorded indie records for were on major labels. Tad was on a bigger label. Mudhoney was on Warner Brothers. Nirvana was signed to a major. Alice in Chains was on a major. Soundgarden was on a major label. The Screaming Trees were on a major label record. All of this was happening at once. It was nothing like that had ever happened in this music scene ever before. And then shortly after that, other bands were getting record deals, like 7-Year Bitch, the Presidents of the United States a couple of years later. Other bands were getting signed to bigger indie labels, like Coffin Break ended up on Epitaph Records. Gashuffer was on Epitaph Records. Epitaph was pretty big at the time. Skinyard ended up on a part of SST, but we broke up at the beginning of 1992, actually, and I just went for the record producer thing full time at that point. We were lucky we broke up before the major labels came for us, because we'd already been a band for 7 years, and I don't think there was much else we could accomplish artistically. So it was the right time for us to stop. And of course, our singer did grunt truck, ended up on Roadrunner, which was a bigger label. Our drummer Barrett joined the Screaming Trees for 10 years. Um, I became a record producer. You know, everything worked out. So Skinyard escaped that whole major label thing. It's probably the smartest thing we ever did. Um, so the early 90s were strange because there was this major label thing going on, and yet all the bands that got signed to the major labels, most of them weren't that happy. You know, it seemed like a difficult transition for a lot of people. I think the Pearl Jam guys, they sort of dealt with it pretty well. The Soundgarden guys, they dealt with it pretty well. They sort of knew what they were getting into. A lot of the other bands, I'm not sure if they necessarily enjoyed it. Um, so that's a tough thing. You know, you got to be careful what you wish for. You might get it. Well, by the middle 90s, I spent most of my time working in other countries, um,
Right.
which was perfectly fine with me. And since then, I've made records, I think, in 14 countries.
Oh,
And
wow.
I have clients all over the world now who send me things to mix and master. So, you know, Seattle did what it did, but I'm doing okay.
Was it, and I hope I'm not sort of being mean about it, but was it bizarre in especially the mid 90s, I guess late 90s, to hear so many bands that kind of sounded like Seattle bands, but weren't really? I think there's many of them are still at it. It's sound that's really really utilized.
I don't mind it now. Now it's been 30 years. It's just, you know, there were still people who, you know, wanted to sound like Led Zeppelin 20 years after Led Zeppelin, and people who wanted to sound like Jimi Hendrix 20 years after Jimi Hendrix, hell, 5 years after Jimi Hendrix. Um, it's perfectly fine for people to want to sound like Soundgarden or Mudhoney or something like that 20 or 30 years after those bands made their best material. I don't see a problem with it now. I saw a problem with it at the time while I was making those records, to hear a band come along and sound just like them a year later. That seemed a little, what's the word, disingenuous. You might have to, you know, that seemed a little, I guess you'd call it a copycat thing. There were bands explicitly doing a copycat thing um, in the 90s where they were actually studying the sound. I mean, there were a few bands that sounded, too many bands that sounded exactly like Alice in Chains. I don't know
Right.
why that band in particular, but there were a number of bands that really, really sounded like Alice in Chains. Some of them were very good at it, but it kind of bothered me. Um, and there were a few bands that sounded much too much like Nirvana. And sometimes I have actually gotten submissions of music, you know, people wanting to work with me, and I will turn them down because I go, come on, you know, you sound like the only records in your record collection are Nirvana records. What am I going to add to this? Now you're collecting you know, the Nirvana producer too. Why don't you write some more songs? You know, I'm a little hard on bands that are really imitative. I mean, you know, it's okay to like something and want to sound like it, but you also need to find your own sound because, you know, Nirvana's already been done. They did it. Soundgarden already did it. You don't need to sound exactly the same. You got to work a little harder and find your own unique voice. So, you know, but at the same time, now it's 30 years later. I don't mind if somebody sounds a little bit like this or that band that I worked with. That's natural. That's going to happen, you know, as long as they have some other creativity that they add to it. Um, you know, and the other thing is my clients are kind of self-selecting, so to speak. The people that contact me tend to be the people that liked the records that I did 30 years ago, and I just have to accept that. Um, that's how it is. But I do look for things that are new and different and unique and creative because it keeps me interested in my job.
Right. I do want to ask you something, not to hold you too long, and this is apropos of nothing, but maybe Nirvana that you mentioned. Were you involved with those demos of Nirvana and a member of the Screaming Trees? There are a few covers, a few Lead Belly covers that are floating out there, and I'm wondering if you were involved with those.
Well, yeah, I did record those. The only recordings I'm aware of are the ones we did in the studio, which were just 3 or 4 songs.
Right, right.
And one song was "Where Did You Sleep Last Night," which it went nowhere and until I was recording Mark Lanegan's first solo record, and he said, "Hey, that song that I recorded with Kurt, let's put it on my record." And Kurt said, "Yeah, that sounds great." So we put "Where Do You Sleep Last Night" on the winding sheet. I think Kurt is on that song, actually. In fact, there's 2 songs on the winding sheet that Kurt is. There's a song called "Down in the Dark" that Kurt sings a harmony vocal on. But it wasn't actually part of the jury. The session was called The Jury. Kurt called me up and he said, "Mark and I have been trying to write some songs together and we want to book some studio time." And Sub Pop said they'll pay for it. I said, "Okay, this sounds interesting." So then they came to the studio and they said, "Well, we forgot all the songs we wrote." They never recorded them. "We forgot the stuff we were working on, so we're just going to do Lead Belly covers instead." And I said, "Okay." So they did this song, "Gray Goose." They never put a vocal on it. It's one riff over and over. You can hear it on the box set. They did "Ain't It a Shame," which Kurt sang on. They did "Where Do You Sleep Last Night," which Mark Lanegan sang on. And you might have to remind me, there might be another song somewhere, but there wasn't anything else. I don't think there was anything else with a vocal. They never
I think
finished
those are it,
it.
but was there ever a plan to finish it as a record or EP or anything like that?
No, nothing. We did one session and I never heard from them again. Um, we had Mark Pickrell from the Screaming Trees was drumming. I don't remember who played bass. Chris Novoselic played bass on one song, I think. Yeah, it was a strange situation, really. It wasn't particularly organized, so there was no actual band. It was just kind of a project that happened one day and went nowhere.
Right, right. And what's it like, if I may ask, working with Mark Lanegan, because you did mention the winding sheet. I think that's one of the scariest. I mean this in a very kind way. One of the scariest records I've ever heard. Well, and a brilliant record.
I'm pretty happy with it. I also got to play bass on it, which was fun. I think I'm playing bass on about 6 of the songs. It was a great record. It only took like 5 or 6 days to make total, which was outstanding. He was in a very creative situation. I had just recorded Buzz Factory for the Screaming Trees, I think just a few months before we worked on the Winding Sheet album. And then about a year later, we started working on the next record, which was Whiskey for the Holy Ghost. He actually started that record with Terry Date, who was another record producer here in town. Very established, a good man, Terry. He worked with Metal Church, actually, and also with Soundgarden. So Mark did some recording with Terry, and then he came and did some recording with me, and then he did some recording with somebody else. And he ended up taking like, I don't know, 2 or 3 years to make his second solo record. Whereas the Winding Sheet took a few days and was done. And I'm still very happy with that record because it doesn't sound like anything else I recorded at the time. It is a unique album. And the Winding Sheet, of course, is amazing. But, Mark had sort of we'd call it a sophomore jinx, which is hard to explain. But it's the curse of the second record when you second guess everything.
Right.
It was so easy the first time, but now it's serious and you got to like analyze. He overanalyzed everything. There was so much material re-recorded that he would just drop it and write more songs. It was painful to watch, but he finally finished the record, which is good.
And his records are sensational. And actually, I was looking through your list of credits, and it's quite incredible. And most of it, I suppose, is tied to what you might call alternative rock. But there is also one as well, that I wasn't aware of, and it's a Bruce Dickinson production credit. And I have to ask you about that.
Yes, Bruce was a good time. Here's the thing. It's a strange thing on my discography has got, there's a lot of hard rock records, but then there's a few other records. There's some Americana, there's some folk, there's some acoustic things, there's a lot of punk rock, a lot of garage rock, and then there's a certain amount of metal that's always been there because a guitar is a guitar. I'm going to record a loud guitar. I don't care what your genre is. If it's guitar, bass, drums, and a singer, I'm pretty good at recording it. And I grew up listening to a lot of metal, and actually I had a few Iron Maiden records when I was younger. So when I got the phone call from Bruce Dickinson, I was ready. I said, okay, I mean, if I was thinking to myself, if Rick Rubin can work with AC/DC, why can't I work with Bruce Dickinson? So um, I had a good time. I ended up, Bruce was not in Iron Maiden at the time. He was looking to do something different. It turns out we're the same age. He was the young guy in Iron Maiden. Um, so he said to me, he had heard some other records I did. Bruce had I think once a week, a show. The BBC had given him his own radio show. It was like an hour on late at night somewhere or something like that, where he could play whatever he wanted. And he was very, very aware of what was going on in Seattle. He knew about Soundgarden. He knew about all the records I'd produced, and he was kind of a fan of a lot of that stuff. And he said, "Well, this is new music. It doesn't sound like the same old '70s metal." He said to me, "I want to make a modern sounding hard rock record that doesn't sound like Iron Maiden." And I said, I'm your guy. I can do that. Have you got songs? Do you have a band? Let's see what's going on. So I ended up spending almost 4 months of my life in London and in other parts of England working with Bruce on this record. First, we went over and I met the band and saw them play, and they started writing songs right in front of me, and I was there for a lot of the songwriting process. I just put my opinions in, but it's their songs. And there was a lot of rehearsal. There was pre-production. He had the money to do it and spend some time on it. And I'm pretty satisfied of how the record came out, but it didn't do his career much good. He's back in Iron Maiden now. He had to do these records. He did a whole series of solo records, and they're all interesting records. But as he went on, they got more and more sounding like Iron Maiden. And so the record we made is the one that sounds the least like Iron Maiden, and is probably the least influential of his albums. Actually, it's kind of a cult record because some people, I find out now 25 years later, some people really like the record. It's called Skunk Works. It's a strange album because it doesn't sound like any of his other solo records. It didn't really do his career much good at the time, and it didn't really do my career much good at the time because nobody in the United States ever heard it. It was on a record label that went bankrupt right before the record was released. So it ended up coming out on another label and got no attention in the US. There was no tour, the usual bad luck story, and a few years later, he was back in Iron Maiden anyway and filling stadiums once again. I did see Bruce come through Seattle a few years later playing a small club outside of Seattle, which was pretty interesting.
Wow.
And then, a few years after that, he was in the Tacoma Dome with Iron Maiden. So, business is business.
Very interesting to sort of hear his voice in that context. If basically anything like the Seattle sound that became so popular internationally could have happened elsewhere. As you mentioned, there were many music scenes throughout the US. A lot of it is very interesting. A lot of it is documented. But obviously, the story of Seattle that involves some very famous bands and a lot of underground bands. that story is maybe the most famous of that era in the US. Could it have happened in any other place, or can it happen again?
I don't know, because that was one of the last pre-internet uh, musical phenomena that we can think about. It was regional because it was isolated for a long time and had a chance to develop uniquely and independently. And it's hard for me to imagine if something geographically isolated would happen quite so easily now, because of the internet and worldwide connectivity. I think the cycle of things happening is faster now, and I think things are not geographically isolated. Things are more isolated. Things are more grouped. I don't quite understand how to put this, because I don't know if the internet has changed everything so much. The universal connectivity. Again, here I am talking to you 9 or 10 time zones away. This would have been impossible in the 80s. It's just inconceivable. And it would probably have cost me hundreds and hundreds of dollars in law. I don't know if something like that, it's the geographic isolation part of it that seems like it would be impossible now, because as soon as something happened, everyone in the world would hear it over the internet. And immediately there would be all this self-awareness. It's almost like, how can you do the magical trick if everybody is watching too closely?
Right. Well, as you mentioned, and it sort of gave me, and I guess a lot of musicians, hope. You mentioned that the original Seattle bands weren't that confident in their abilities to begin with. So that's something to be hopeful about. Well, in closing, I do want to ask you, because you mentioned you were starting to work on, hopefully, a new record besides your production work. How do you see that evolving in the next year or so, supposing that things do return to something closer to normal?
Which record were you referring to? I'm sorry, I missed part of your question.
I think you mentioned that you were starting work, hopefully, on a new solo record. So how are you looking to write that, and I suppose maybe promote it live if that opportunity arises?
Well, as of right now, I have no songs and no band, so I don't have an answer for you on that. Hopefully it will be faster than a decade before I make another one. I just need to find the musicians and get inspired. And that always ends up happening. In the meantime, I've got Orca, the psych trio, and I have some more stuff that we have that I need to mix and put up on our Bandcamp site. That's beyond Captain Orca.bandcamp.com. Record is jamming out now. I've got this is funny. I'm trying to remember. Oh, my other band is called Purple Strange. And we made a record. It's called Purple Strange. That's the title. And I have Ron, the guitar player from Love Battery, is in that band with me. And we made an album, and we're working on another one. Unfortunately, again, it came out during the pandemic and nobody heard it, but it's up on the internet. Sky Cries Mary, I have Kevin Whitworth, who is the other guitar player from Love Battery. He's in that band with me. Again, I haven't seen him in a year and a half, but we made another record together, and you can hear it right now on the internet. So, and I have the band with my wife, which is called MKB Ultra. But that band is kind of, we're kind of on ice right now because, again, we haven't seen any of the band members in a year and a half. So I don't know what's going on with that. So as far as solo material, we'll see. I'm not fast. Things will happen when they happen.
But the wait was very much worthwhile. The new record sounds brilliant.
I appreciate that. Thank you for that. And thanks for writing about Samstag. Actually, how do you pronounce that? Samstag?
I think it's Am Samstag, but I might be wrong. My German's not great.
Yeah. Now the band was here recording with me weeks before the pandemic. It was February of 2020 when they were last here with me in Seattle. I mean, it was their second trip to Seattle. I'd worked with them before. And I mean, Gaby almost didn't make it home. I mean, the airline, the lockdowns happened just weeks later.
Wow.
I mean, we already were hearing about this virus when she came to Seattle. It was kind of a risk. You know, everybody was fine, but that was, you know, there were a lot of records that almost got finished right when the lockdown happened. And like, I have a band coming in this weekend that was recording with me in February 2020. It is just now
Wow.
going to finish the album that we started then. I think there's a lot of this going on. In between, I did a lot of archival things, you know, because people who were locked down, they look in their closets and they find old recordings that haven't been finished. And they think, well, now I have time to finish them. I mean, I did the same with my old solo record from 1992. It's called Endino's Earthworm. I remixed the whole thing and put it on my Bandcamp site because I had time. I also remixed the fifth Skin Yard record. It's called Inside the Eye. I retitled it Beyond the Eye, actually, because I changed it so much and I put it on my Bandcamp site. It's the kind of thing you do when you have time. So there was a lot of strange, I've worked with a band. There's some old stuff for a band called Bam Bam that I pulled out and did some mixing on. Did some remastering for, there's just people bringing me projects from 20 or 30 years ago that never got released. It's interesting. That's what this pandemic has done. It's brought a lot of things out of the closet. I know you didn't ask me this, but
Is
just,
it pleasing to sort of work on older music, or is it a bit more challenging because it's not fresh? You kind of have to put yourself in that perspective, I guess.
Well, most of it is stuff I didn't work on originally. So it's fresh to me. It's a challenge. I think, you know, what tape machine was this? What format? ADATs, 8-track 1/4 inch, 16-track 1 inch. I got to find a machine that'll play this tape. I actually have a vegetable dehydrator back here behind me. It's right there. That is the food dehydrator that I use for baking tapes. You can see it right. Let me see if there it is. Well, you can see it behind me in the corner.
Right, I do.
The food dehydrator. You put tapes in it and leave them for 12 hours and it drives the moisture off the tapes, and then you can do a digital transfer from them. It's a crucial thing.
Oh.
So
does that damage the inevitably the original tape?
Nope, does not damage the tape at all. In fact, the tape will play perfectly afterwards, and you can do your digital transfer and the tape will be good for about 6 months.
Oh, that's brilliant.
So anything older than 1995, anything older than about 2005, if it's analog tape, I've had to bake it. You run it at about 120 degrees Fahrenheit for about 12 hours and it will play perfectly. I've had to do it with hundreds of tapes, Nirvana tapes, Soundgarden tapes, bands you've never heard of. It's part of I call it forensic, recovery, part of the job.
That's brilliant. And you, in saying that, I can sort of guess why somebody would prefer digital over analog in this case.
Yes, the old technology is getting older and it's not going to be around that much longer. There's nobody to fix the tape machines anymore. Nobody's making new tape machines. It's harder and harder to get tape. And as soon as you try and record on analog tape, you realize why nobody does it anymore, because you realize, oh, I can't fix anything. And I have to align the machine and there's dirt on the heads and the heads have gotten magnetized and, oh, the tape speed is not quite right. And there's all these variables. I'm very happy to be working digitally nowadays.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Well, once more, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. And this was brilliant. This was a highlight of mine for sure.
A pleasure, sir. Thank you.
That was brilliant.
Again. All right.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Yep, you too.
Goodbye.